Have you ever heard somebody say that music is a universal language? Usually, when people say this, it's coming from a very well-intentioned place. They're trying to say that music brings the world together and transcends language boundaries and cultural borders and stuff like that. Well, let me explain how if we take that statement as fact, we actually end up doing more harm than good.
I like very much this corn.
At first, it might seem like calling music a universal language is somehow inspiring, or like it elevates music as this magical, wonderful thing. But the reality is that calling music a universal language actually understates how amazing music truly is. Claiming universality diminishes the depth and diversity of real musical practices. And when you diminish the depth and diversity of real musical practices, what you're doing is diminishing the depth and diversity of real cultures. And when I'm talking about cultures in this context, I don't just mean cultures in the macro sense. I don't just mean cultures from a nationality standpoint or ethnicity standpoint. I'm talking about a perspective that views each musical tradition as its own sort of micro-culture. So, in that way, rather than music being one single universal language, it actually becomes universal in a much more meaningful sense. And to use a linguistic point of imitation here, I find it helpful to think of music itself in its entirety as a universe. A universe made up of many different microcultures, each with its own values, behaviors, and aesthetics. And like the spatial universe, the musical universe is massive and extremely difficult to map and explore, but in my opinion, that makes it all the more worth exploring. Think about it this way. How much has humanity gained from looking up at the stars and respecting each and every one of those stars? Now, how much can we gain from looking at all of our own cultures and traditions and respecting each one of those? Seeing music as one language overlooks the incredible variety that humans have developed across time and geography. By acknowledging music's complexity, we honor how majestic and rich music making is for humanity. So I hope you're beginning to see why calling music a universal language is not only misleading, but why it can actually be damaging as well. So I have a bunch of things I want to make for you, and if you'd like to help me make them, you can support me by subscribing, arguing with me in the comments, and checking the description for links to Patreon and other places that will directly contribute to my work for you. I'm just getting started on this YouTube channel, and I have a lot of stuff I want to do, but I need time and resources to do those. So if you want to help out, please do so in any way that you can. Thank you so much. Now back to the video. One of the main reasons that people often think that music is a universal language is because they're capable of liking and enjoying music outside of their own culture. Or they found themselves singing along to a song in a different language with lyrics they don't even understand. Well, the truth is that it's entirely possible to enjoy how something sounds without understanding it. And it's entirely possible to understand something without fully comprehending it. And yes, I do want to specifically make a distinction between understanding and comprehension. Understanding is recognizing surface-level elements, while comprehension means grasping the cultural context, historical significance, and technical nuances that give music its full meaning. When it comes to liking how something sounds, but not understanding it, and definitely not comprehending it, I'll give a personal example. I really enjoy how the Russian language sounds. I think it's fun to listen to, makes some really great memes, it's just a great sounding language in my opinion. I can only understand like 3 words on a good day, but I love listening to people speak it. I also don't know all that much about Russian culture or history, but that doesn't stop me from liking how the language sounds. In fact, that doesn't stop me from liking Russian music. I have all kinds of Russian music that I listen to, and it's in Russian, and sometimes they speak or sprinkle English words in there or whatever, but I still like it. Even though I have no idea what it's about, I could lazily conclude that music is a universal language and stop exploring further. But when I research a song's background, artist, history, or cultural context, the listening experience becomes dramatically richer and more meaningful. Understanding and comprehension makes the music experience better, but as a musician, I'm not only thinking about the lyrics, I'm also thinking about the chords, the melody, and the rhythm, the harmonic structure, and everything like that goes into the music itself. Each tradition has its own musical devices and characteristics that make it unique and help you recognize it. And learning about that and studying those devices does nothing but enhance the experience of listening to that music. Having both the lyrical meaning and the musical comprehension combined makes just a great time. So not only is submitting to this lame idea that music is a universal language wrong, but it's boring. It ruins something for you. It is so much more interesting to dive into the nuances of music and people. Those nuances are why I like the term musical traditions rather than just saying a genre. I think that saying musical traditions captures the values, behaviors, aesthetics, and social functions that feed back into how the music itself actually sounds, and how the audiences and listeners experience the music. Each tradition has a distinct identity formed by multiple elements: instruments and tuning, performance rules, stage behavior, audience interaction, clothing, food, and social context. These elements all combine to create a complete cultural system far beyond what the word genre captures. And that's how we can tell what kind of music somebody listens to just by basically just looking at them. And all of that stuff is a lot more than just genre, and I'm fully aware that I'm not alone in these beliefs. There's plenty of anthropological and ethnomusicological studies that show how societies embed music into local rituals, identity, and social norms. And there's been a few notable musicologists that have said things like, that music is a mosaic of separate traditions and that music is always shaped by the culture that created it. So when a tradition prescribes not just the sounds, but also performance etiquette, ways of dressing, communal participation, all that stuff, that's all influenced by the larger macro culture that it came out of. For instance, a jazz jam session has an improvisatory ethic that sets it apart from a classical concert. How you behave at a jazz jam session is entirely different from how you would behave at a classical pianist's performance. In fact, if you get those behaviors mixed up and you flip them, you're going to get kicked out of both places. And speaking of improvisation, that's a huge thing all over the world. In Indian classical music, improvisation itself becomes a cultural ritual. Audience members who understand the tradition recognize and appreciate the subtle variations within strict traditional frameworks. If you were at a performance of Indian classical music, you would sit and listen to that just like you would sit and listen to a Western concert pianist performance. You would sit politely in this classical concert, Indian or Western, because that's the culture. But if you sit an Indian musician and a jazz musician together, they're going to have a lot of learning to do before they're able to really play music together. The musical traditions might share improvisation, but that's about as far as it goes. I guess they both have rhythm and a concept of melody, but that's really about it. The whole harmonic system that jazz musicians work in is completely different than the scale system that Indian musicians work in. They'd have to learn each other's musical traditions before they can really play together. And then when they do play together, you're going to be able to hear their own home influences coming out in their playing. You'll be able to hear the jazz in the jazz musician and the Indian classical in the Indian classical musician. Even if they're both playing jazz or they're both playing Indian classical music, it's going to come out naturally because that's where they're from. It's kind of like a musical accent. However, if music was a universal language, they would just be able to sit down immediately and start playing. That it would be universal. They wouldn't have to learn anything. They already know everything. They already know it all. It's universal. We all know it already. So no learning, because that's how it would have to work. No borders, no boundaries, no uniqueness, no individuality. We all know everything. Music is music, right? That's obviously not true. And those two examples at least kind of live in the same tuning systems, almost. If we talk about a different South Asian music tradition like Balinese gamelan or something like that, that tuning system is completely different. Gamelan tuning systems are based on the instruments themselves because of how they're shaped. They use gongs and bells, or they use suspended metal bars, and so the physics of sound is different with those materials. Or not the physics of sound, but how those physical materials vibrate and produce sound. it's different from a string or a tube or something like that. Like a trumpet has a tube and it has a vibrating column of air inside of it, or a violin or a guitar has a string with harmonics on their strings and stuff like that. That's not possible with bell-shaped, gong-shaped instruments, which is what a lot of gamelan ensembles are made up of. Their harmonic series is different because of the shape. So each gamelan ensemble is really tuned to itself. Each gamelan ensemble has a unique tuning because as they're built, the characteristics of the metal and the materials, they come out through the process of the instruments being made. So if there is a flute in the ensemble, that specific flute is tuned to be able to play with the gongs and everything else that is making up the rest of the ensemble. And if there's like a melodic, like xylophone instrument, the scales and melodies that instrument plays is based on the tuning of the gongs and bell-shaped instruments in the ensemble. There's a whole video about this that I actually watched to learn about how this works, and it's super cool. I'll try to put a link if I can figure out how to do that. Click here, or maybe in the description. Both. Look for both. And don't even get me started on all the African tuning systems and instruments, or even how jazz comes from those African traditions. And then if you take a jazz musician and you try to put him back into African traditions, he's going to feel out of place. You won't know what's going on if you sit down in a drum circle unless you've been taught about that culture and that tradition. You have to learn. It's not universal already. It's not a universal language. You have to learn it different in each culture and in each tradition. Even if, sure, they all have rhythm. Okay, good. There's pitch. Okay, cool. But that's about it. Everything else is different. So let's get into some examples of different types of music so that I can explain a little bit more about why genre is really not that useful of a word. So I'm just going to list some stuff off about different genres, different musical traditions, and we're going to start from there. So let's start with punk or punk rock. So punk is known for being loud, fast, rebellious, chaotic, ripped clothes, crazy hair, mosh pits, stuff like that. The visual aesthetics and the behaviors of both the audience and the performers both reflect this kind of collection of values. It might feel weird calling these things traditions, but they really are. Punk is opposite of tradition, right? That's what the point is, but really it's still traditions. You can look back at pictures of the original punks and you can see how the heritage of that is still alive today. That's tradition. It's how that works. So when you take all of these values and behaviors and traditions and put them together, from an outsider perspective, you might see a mess, right? It's going to be very noisy music, noisy people, noisy visuals. Crowds are going to be doing crazy violent things, right? But if you're in the tradition, if you're part of this culture, this microculture, this musical tradition, it's gonna make sense to you. You're gonna feel at home. You're gonna feel comfortable. It's what you know. And I don't know about you, but I don't think the word genre captures all of that stuff very well. The word leaves a lot to be desired. And you might think I'm being picky, but I think when we look at hip-hop in the same way, hip-hop is definitely a culture. I'd say that it's beyond microculture status at this point. It's so huge. It's so global. It's just been elevated basically to just regular old culture status at this point. Even though hip-hop is originally an American thing, you can go anywhere in the world and find hip-hop. France, Korea, Russia, anywhere. Hip-hop is going to be there. China, even though there's been such a huge separation between America and China, there's a huge influence of hip-hop in China. There's even a huge influence of Chinese R&B. Like Taiwanese R&B, mainland Chinese R&B is super popular, and they honestly do a really great job. Anyway, hip-hop. They're going to bring out their own flavors of the macro culture. So Russian hip hop is going to be different from Korean hip hop, and everything's going to be different from American hip hop. Just like the jazz musician and the Indian musician will bring out their own kind of musical accents, the microcultures and musical traditions are influenced by the macro culture that they're within. So in that way, hip hop is still a microculture and not a macro culture. It's not quite big enough It's, it's not as deep and rich as, for example, like Irish culture, right? Irish culture is super deep and rich and it's really old and everything like that. Hip hop isn't quite the same. So hip hop's still a microculture. It's just a big one. Some things that make hip hop unique are DJing, MCing, rapping, breakdancing, graffiti, a lot of unique slang, unique fashion, all of that stuff. Not to mention its critical role in American history in the form of advocating for civil rights and giving people that didn't have a voice the ability to really get their message out. And hip hop has become that kind of medium for political outcry and fighting back against oppression all over the world. Not only is it that way for the African American population, but it's a medium that makes sense for all kinds of oppressed people all over the world. And to be honest, it's kind of hard to think of musical traditions that aren't surrounding or surrounded by political movements. Music is historically a way for people that are oppressed to cry out against their oppressors, or reversal of that, for the oppressors to propagandize against their oppressed. That is a whole other video topic, but music is political, everything is politics, and music is everything, so music is political. But moving on, heavy metal, visually distinct, right? You think of metal, you can immediately picture someone who plays metal. You can immediately picture someone who listens to metal. You can even picture the people who would be in the audience at a metal concert. And if you know anything about metal, you know how many millions of subgenres there are. Death metal, power metal, black metal, symphonic metal, pirate metal, folk metal. I can go on and on and on. And each of those different types of metal have their own nuanced aesthetics, their own microcultures, right? Wait, but isn't metal a microculture? So if there's subgenres, so that means that there's microcultures, a microculture within a microculture. Yeah, it works. But regardless of these differences between the cultures, microcultures, metal fans tend to be known for being extremely kind and nice and safe people to be around. Almost entirely. Let's not talk about the ones that aren't. And there's a sense of brotherhood among metal fans. To an outsider from this culture that doesn't know anything about metal, they might listen to the music and think literally the opposite of all of that. And especially when you look at lyrics and themes and everything in the music, the assumptions made here are not going to be pretty. But believe it or not, there's a lot of overlap between classical music fans and metal fans. And I don't even really need to explain this. All you need to do is look up a metal guitar cover of Bach or Beethoven or Mozart, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But even though a fan of heavy metal can also enjoy classical music, if you go to a classical music concert and you act like you would at a metal concert, you're gonna get kicked out. Same thing if you try to perform like a heavy metal musician on the stage with an orchestra. As long as it's not, agreed upon beforehand, if you play violin, but you play it like you're in a metal band, you're gonna get kicked out of the orchestra. Or if you show up to your orchestra concert dressed like you would for your metal band, you're going to get fired and you're probably never going to work again. So the culture is very different. And that specifically is just about etiquette. But classical music is very heavy on etiquette, which is just part of the culture. That's part of it, not only for audiences and performers, but etiquette and how the music is performed, etiquette and how it's learned, etiquette and how the music is talked about and discussed. There's specialized jargon. There's reverence for composers, reverence for specific scores, reverence for conductors. There's literally thousands of years of history to be familiar with in classical music, because classical music influences everything. It influences all of the other genres, all of the other musical traditions that we've talked about. And I mean classical music from the West. From the East, the North, the South, up and down, left, right, the classical music in your country. If we talk about North Indian classical music, the Indian pop music nowadays is extremely influenced by it. Even jazz. Jazz and classical music are supposed to be completely opposite of each other, but if you know anything about them, you know that they're really more similar than they're not. Even though classical music doesn't really have improvisation or jam sessions or swing or anything like that, there's still standard songs that every jazz musician should know. There are standard pieces that every classical musician should know. There's different sub-styles of classical music, different sub-styles of jazz. Jazz has pretty strict audience and performance etiquette. It might seem looser, it might seem more chill from classical, but if you break the cultural norm, you break that boundary, you're gonna probably get kicked out. There's literally a slang term in jazz for when musicians in a jam session are musically bullying you. If you get vibed at a jam session, that means that the other musicians, they don't like you, and they're trying to make you feel uncomfortable, and they're being rude through the music. It's a little bit ridiculous, but again, that's the culture. That's the tradition. That's what happens. And if you don't, quote unquote, speak the dialect of each of these traditions, you're not going to fit in. You're not going to be able to get along with the people that do speak the dialect. You're not going to be able to fully appreciate or truly comprehend the tradition, the music, the genre, the whatever. If music was a universal language, there'd be no musical bullying at jam sessions. There'd be no grandparents up in arms about their punk rock sons and daughters. We would all be on the same page. But that is not how it is. Music is not a universal language. However, and this is a big however, there are plenty of universal aspects to music, just not in the universal language way. And really, music isn't a language. Music is not a true language. Regardless of the genre or musical tradition that we're talking about, without words, there's no true lexicon or grammar. There's no syntax. There's no semantic units. And regardless of that, there's no universal lexicon or grammar. There's no shared vocabulary or standardized semantic units across all cultures. A universal language doesn't exist even in a linguistic sense, let alone in a musical sense. So not only is it not a language, it's again not a universal language. Both Igor Stravinsky and Leonard Bernstein have done a Harvard lecture series where they go deep into music's relationship with language. And the conclusion that both of them get to is that while possible that we can draw analogies, music is not a language. Leonard Bernstein's The Unanswered Question series compares music and linguistics, but ultimately shows music's lack of universal semantics. And Leonard Bernstein isn't even talking about anything other than Western classical music. He's busy talking about Mozart and everything like that. He's not even thinking about Indian ragas or Korean percussion. And Stravinsky concluded that music is meaningful in its own domain, but it can't really be translated into words without losing its essence. And again, there are universal aspects to music, but music is not a universal language. Every culture on Earth has something that we would call music, but the structures, scales, aesthetics, everything around it vary drastically. And they're unintelligible outside of their own contexts. A major or minor chord to us in the West, I'm assuming you're American or European or something, we associate that with happy or sad. Major is happy, minor is sad. But in other places, those associations don't exist. Even in our own culture, the idea that happy is major and sad is minor, that's not really totally true either. One of the easiest ways to make someone cry is to pair really sad imagery, like a really sad sequence in a movie or something, and then have quote-unquote happy music playing, and then suddenly tears. Like major chords, major music playing over a sad sequence. Think of Up, the Up Buried Life song at the intro. Super happy music, right? But sad events, and then it just makes you cry. If you're going to start crying your eyes out at a major chord, is that happy or sad? And guess what determines for us whether or not those major or minor chords are happy or sad? Our culture. Cultural conditioning. It's a thing. Whether or not you think so, whether or not you think you've been culturally conditioned, you have. It's just how our brains work when we grow up in a place with things that are done regularly. That's just how it works. There's no escaping it. Sorry. So I've spent the majority of this video talking about why music is not the same across the world and between cultures. Now, I'd like to talk about why music actually is the same across cultures in the world. I want to give you guys a closer look at the universal aspects of music. The number one uniting factor of the world's musical traditions is the same thing that unites literally everything else: physics. Our vocal cords all function the same way. Our air vibrates the same way. Our strings vibrate the same way. Our drums vibrate the same way. Our scales, chords, consonances, and dissonances are all derived or heavily influenced by the physics of sound. If you were to sort of zoom in on one single pitch, you would actually see a collection of pitches that combine to create the timbre, tone, and character of that sound. This is true for every single note played on any instrument or sung by any person. The pitches for major chords and the notes for scales, especially the major scale and especially the pentatonic scale, are all present in every single note. And this is true for both pitched and unpitched instruments. Unless the sound is truly 100% a pure sine wave, it will have overtones that create some kind of timbre. Overtones are pitches, pure tones with smooth-looking sine waves that occur above and relative to the fundamental pitch in a sound. If you've ever heard the lowest strings on a piano and noticed how they don't really sound all that low, but more just kind of clangy, that's because what you're hearing is mostly made up of the overtones, and not really that much of the fundamental pitch. In this case, the fundamental note would be the one that matches the key you pressed. If you want to know the exact pitches that occur in these overtones, you'll need to look at something called the overtone series. If you play guitar or another instrument where you can touch the strings with your fingers, you'll probably know this as the harmonic series. Both terms mean the same thing. There's a sort of ladder of pitches that occurs naturally in sounds, and the volume of each of the pitches, which pitches are louder than the others, determines the timbre of the sound. The fundamental note is at the bottom of this ladder, and that is the lowest frequency. Then there's a pattern of higher frequencies above that fundamental. The overtones. That's the pattern of the frequencies above the fundamental. The overtones, they're the tones that are over the fundamental. All of those, they are making sound, they're all vibrating, they're all going at the same time, and they make up the overtone series. In a way, you could think of the timbre of a sound as its texture. The amount of bumps, sine waves, that you can hear, when you run your hand over, listen to, the material, sound, determines what the texture, timbre, feels, sounds like. Let me say that again. The amount of bumps that you can feel when you run your hand over the material determines what the texture feels like. The number of sine waves that you can hear when you listen to the sound determines what the timbre sounds like. If you can only hear or feel the fundamental, then the timbre or texture is going to be perfectly smooth. On the opposite spectrum, if you can feel and hear everything, then it's going to be so dense that it ends up kind of being smooth too. You can't really tell the difference between the feelings and what you're hearing. It's kind of a lot. The interesting timbres and textures are kind of in the middle of these two extremes. The extreme of really very little and then way too much. In the middle is where we can tell what's kind of going on, and it gets more interesting. Going back to the gamelan example that I talked about earlier in the video, gamelan instruments, like church bells, produce a distinctive timbre because of their physical shape. Unlike Western instruments where we impose our tuning system onto them, Each gamelan ensemble creates its own internal tuning relationship between the instruments based on their natural acoustic properties. Our modern Western 12-tone system evolved through the centuries of mathematical development and acoustic research to create standardized pitches that work in any key. Even though the physics of church bells don't match this system, we still try to force them into the 12-tone system. That's why some chords sound really dissonant when played on bells. Even between cultures that use a lot of string instruments, like Italian and Chinese, the tuning systems are different, or they were. There are historical accounts from the 13th century of Europeans going to China and finding that Chinese music is out of tune. But then the Chinese thought that the European music was weird and out of tune, because they were both used to their own systems. Nowadays, I think both European and Chinese tuning systems match each other, but back then they were still kind of figuring things out. Early missionaries that brought Western hymns to Africa weren't really successful. The people didn't like it. They didn't connect with the music until those hymns were able to be adapted into their own style, until the foreign, un-African hymns were adapted into the domestic, familiar African style. Western composers tried to write music for gamelan. They tried to combine gamelan with the orchestra, but they didn't retune their orchestra instruments. They instead tried to retune the gamelan instruments, and that took away all of the great characteristics that make gamelan unique. And it just didn't work, because the gamelan tuning system is center to the gamelan sound that they fell in love with in the first place. And even worse, the Westerners ended up dismissing the gamelan as just being wrong or bad. And that's kind of beside the point I'm really trying to make here. My point is that humans are universally musical, but each tradition is built from local values, context, and histories. Comprehending it requires cultural understanding. The Western composers didn't comprehend gamelan, and they weren't able to access it as a musical tool. I love gamelan, but I haven't been involved in that musical tradition. I'm not in that culture. I wouldn't say that I comprehend gamelan. I really enjoy it. I'd say that I have a certain level of understanding about it, but I'm really not an expert, and that's because comprehension requires cultural insight. Understanding Indian raga implies learning about specific ragas' time of day associations or their intricate rules for improvisation. In both jazz and Indian music, there's a bunch of rules about improvising, but those rules aren't the same. And in order to truly play either genre or participate in either musical tradition, you have to know the rules. The reason that those rules exist is to help us make music that sounds like jazz, or sounds like Indian traditional music, or sounds like metal, or sounds like Irish traditional music. Improvising on a Latin chart and a jazz ensemble is not going to be the same as improvising in a 1940 swing band. If Miles Davis auditioned for Duke Ellington's band, he probably wouldn't have got in. That's not a hit on either Miles Davis or Duke Ellington. They're both outstanding in their own traditions, but even though they're both jazz musicians, they're technically in the same tradition, but they're also technically not. If you listen to Duke Ellington's music and you listen to Miles Davis's music, they sound really different. They're speaking different languages at this point, or at least they have very heavy and very different accents. And yeah, you can kind of use language as an analogy to talk about music, but when you really dive into it, you have to understand that it breaks. The analogy breaks, and it breaks pretty quickly. Music might seem like a language, but it's really a giant collection of microcultures. It's a giant mosaic of microcultures. And if you are outside of a microculture, you might call that truly complex tradition simple or weird because you just can't interpret the rules. You don't understand how it works. You can't comprehend the musical tradition. But insiders, people who are familiar with it, they'll hear those layers of nuance and they'll pick up on things that an untrained ear doesn't pick up on. We can't conflate enjoyment and understanding. I can't say I enjoy it and mean that I understand it. those are not the same thing. It's true that we enjoy things more when we understand it, but enjoying is the very bottom line here. It's the bare minimum, and music deserves better than that. You deserve better than that. As you can see, even though almost everything about two musical traditions can be different, the connecting thread is physics. Since most of the musical traditions that humanity has created rely on tubes, strings, or rectangles of some kind, their overtones all work the same. You can still have different tuning systems with the same overtone pattern. In fact, the overtone series itself quickly deviates from the most common tuning system used all over the world, called equal temperament. I don't need to get into what equal temperament is in this video because there are way too many videos talking about that already. Just YouTube equal temperament and you'll find something. All you need to know is that this tuning system is the one that lets us have keys that are perfectly interchangeable. Before equal temperament, each key would essentially be tuned slightly differently, and some would get really ugly and dissonant. Chromatic music is possible because of equal temperament. While each musical tradition can be really complex and be its own microculture, they are all built on the same fundamental principles of physics. How closely to those fundamentals they begin to deviate is primarily what determines how different a musical tradition is from others. If you think about it like a tree trunk, if a tree's trunk splits close to the ground, that split will have a bigger impact on how the rest of the tree grows. A bigger impact than a split that might happen higher up. The musical example of a low split tree trunk would be Arabic music. Arabic musical traditions use strings and tubes, but the tuning systems and scales are very different from most other traditions in the world. Arabic music makes use of microtones and subtle ornamentation techniques that are simply not found elsewhere. Even though the strings of a piano and the strings of an oud have the same overtone series, it's only possible to play Arabic music properly on the oud. Ouds don't have frets, so it's possible, and essentially required, to make use of microtones while playing. That is simply impossible on a normal piano or any other instrument that is locked into 12-tone equal temperament. The other primary uniting factor in music of the world, other than physics, is that every culture in the world has some kind of music in some capacity. What role music plays in a culture varies widely, but it's always there. In fact, from a brain development standpoint, our capacity for music predates our capacity for language. Check out this cool Star Talk video about that. In conclusion, is music a universal language? Absolutely not. It's not even a language. Music is a densely varied, naturally occurring phenomenon that manifests differently depending on the larger culture that it grows out of. By treating music as multiple traditions rather than one universal language, we honor each culture's contributions while encouraging deeper appreciation through learning rather than assuming universal understanding. If you want an eloquent sentence to use to talk about music, try this. Music is a living, breathing tapestry of traditions whose individual threads are each worth a lifetime of celebration. So now, go forth and celebrate. I love you, bye.